What's the new script for masculinity? What's the new set of roles? What's the new set of do's that we've got for men? You could argue we've got quite a lot of don'ts, many of which we need, but not a very long list of do's. And so I think that sense of that category being that question mark now, being open, has just left a lot of men feeling adrift, uncertain of their role, uncertain of their place, uncertain of being needed, wanted. And I think that's feeding into a lot of the things that are easier to measure, like mental health, education, employment, etc. But underlying it, I think it's this coming to terms with this huge revolution that we've seen.
I want to make sure by the end of this conversation, we do our very best to hazard a guess at what that list of do's are for men, but also to kind of fill that question mark. I get so many women and men come up to me, often talking about their young sons, and encouraging me to have more conversations like this because they want a good script for their young sons in a world where their young sons are going online and being offered maybe a not so good script.
Yes.
By certain influencers and influencers online. So that's one of my objectives with having these conversations. And I think it's worth pausing there just to say that from looking at your work, you're not suggesting we go backwards to the old way of things.
No. That's part of the challenge, is that there's in some ways an understandable reaction to change that is disorienting, it's destabilizing, it maybe threatens a sense of status among men. And to reach back for the world as it once was, very recently, right? This is not, we don't have to go back millennia, probably only have to go back one generation or two generations to a world where men had their roles, women had their roles, everyone knew their place. And you can see the appeal of that when there's just so much uncertainty, but emphatically not the answer to go back. And I think in this debate, what you very often feel is if those who are perhaps on that more conservative side of the argument, they want to kind of turn back the clock, especially on women and women's roles. But I would say on the other side of the argument, maybe more on the progressive side of the argument or liberal side of the argument in American terms, there's a bit of a sort of turning a blind eye to the actual problems of boys and men.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of young men, and I, having spoken to them and had some responses to my work from them, they feel as if there are two fairly unappetizing options on the table for them. From the right, they get the message of like, you should be more like your father or your grandfather, be a real man, right? Provide, protect, etc. Have a wife that can stay at home, fill in the gap. But then from the left, the message they get is, you should be more like your sister. The problem with your masculinity is your masculinity, and you should be more like a woman. Right. And actually, it's not surprising to me that most young men who are strongly in favor of gender equality, right, they've grown up with it, there's no evidence they're turning against it. So they want gender equality, but they also, there's something about the way they feel in the world that means that they don't want to be treated as there's something wrong with them because they're a man, right? And I think even especially in schools, but maybe more broadly, there's a danger that we treat men like malfunctioning women. So your problem is you're not feminine enough, you're not caring enough, you're not nurturing enough, you're not emotionally vulnerable enough, you don't cry enough, you don't spend enough time with your kids. And I'm not saying those aren't all valid challenges, but if that's all we've got, if in other words we're just defining positive masculinity in a way that is completely synonymous with femininity, I'm not surprised we're seeing a lot of young men in particular say, well, no, I'm not interested in that. And the only other thing else they can see on offer is this more reactionary alternative. And so if we give them that choice between being feminine and being reactionary, it's not clear to me that they're all going to choose the former.
It's interesting because the way that the digital world, the algorithms, the social media are designed is to kind of push you towards camps.
Mm-hmm.
So this like space in the middle of nuance, it's just not going to get the likes, the retweets, the engagement. In fact, it's the ideas on the outside, the men should be more feminine or men should be extremely masculine, that are going to get all of the attention because of the way the algorithms are designed. So if the answer is some kind of nuanced position in the middle, I just can't see in a world how that's ever going to form a tribe and be rewarded by the algorithm. So, this is part of the beauty, I guess, of having podcast conversations, because we're not really held hostage by an algorithm here. We can kind of speak openly, but most of the algorithms don't work in such a way. At the heart of this issue, though, I think is a very difficult question, which is, are men and women different?
Okay, well let's come to that. But can I go back to your previous point?
It's two questions
because I think you're underselling yourself in a way. I agree that the way the algorithm works drives the kind of short-term attention towards those more tribal, simplistic ideas. But the mere fact of your success and the success of others like you, to me, is an incredibly positive sign. It suggests to me that actually there is an appetite for more nuanced conversation. There is an appetite for recognizing that two things can be true at once and that there are trade-offs, like A is mostly good. Like the rise of the women, amazing. Causing some issues that we should deal with. Right? And I have to tell you my own experience of this as a, we've established, boring, chart-driven, policy wonk type person, right? I did this video for Big Think, the YouTube platform, and it's had more comments than I've sold copies of the book.
Oh, wow.
Different audience, of course. My wife calls me, I'm traveling somewhere, and she says, have you read the comments on your video? And I said, of course not. Like, I'm old school journalist, never read the comments. She said, no, we got to. We started reading them together. And by the end of that taxi journey, wherever I was, we're both in tears. Because what we found was young men, including some teenage boys, saying, thank you for recognizing that the problems that boys and young men are facing are real, but not saying, and therefore become a reactionary misogynist. Actually saying, guys, this is a difficult time. There is some transitions. We've got to think about, come to your question about, are they different? That we are different in some ways that we have to talk about, but that in no way means we should be trying to turn back the progress of women. The solution to your problem as a young man is not to make your sister less powerful or independent. And there's a huge appetite for that. It's just hard to articulate. It doesn't drive the algorithm. But I honestly, the conversations you've had around this, that other people are having around this, gives me a lot of hope that actually most young men out there want that real conversation. But it does, I agree, it has to start with a recognition of the fact that there are differences on average between men and women. Right?
What do you think of that phrase, toxic masculinity?
I think it's toxic. I think the term toxic masculinity is toxic. I didn't always think that. It's taken me a while to get to that. But I would now say it's basically a slur. It's a gender slur, if you like. And it's just used too easily, too loosely, too casually to describe male behavior that we don't like. And I would say actually most thoughtful kind of women's groups and feminists are not supporting it now because it's not a great recruiting tool by and large, right? So one big problem with it is if you ask people who use the term toxic masculinity to define non-toxic masculinity, they struggle. They'll say, oh, no, there are positive aspects of masculinity. I say, okay, great, what are they? And they'll say nurturing and caring and kindness and emotional availability. And you go, and is that different from femininity? They say, no, it's the same. Okay, so let me get this straight. Masculinity is either toxic or not masculine. Because if they start saying courage, positive risk-taking, well-channeled competitiveness, do you say, what, are you saying women aren't courageous? No, I'm not saying that. Okay, so sorry, what do you... So it's an empty set. So non-toxic masculinity is basically an empty set. So they can't fill that category. So you've either got toxic or nothing. That's bad. But also just think on a visceral level, it reminds me, and you have a church background, so the phrase toxic masculinity really reminds me of the term original sin. It's something in you that's kind of, you didn't have any choice about it, like you inherited it from previous generations, and it's kind of bad, and we can't get rid of it. So there's kind of, you're born with this flaw.
You've got to repent at all opportunities for your, And
it feels like that to me. It's like, and maybe this is the third point, I don't know, but it's like, honestly, is the best we can offer to young men is a prospectus that we could make them not toxic? How would you like to be non-toxic? isn't that an exciting idea? Like, that's the worst recruiting slogan ever. And so it's driving young men away. It's an incredibly unhelpful term. It's unfairly applied. It used to have some value in academia, like before 2016, it had this very technical term in academia. But I think as a term now, it really just does send this incredibly unfortunate message to men, which doesn't encourage a debate about how to be a better man. I much prefer immature and mature masculinity. I like the idea of saying, like, what does mature masculinity look like? Because you know what immature masculinity looks like, right? And so I think this kind of maturation is a much better way to frame it than toxic, non-toxic.
Is there such a thing as, and I've never asked this question before, but it just came to mind, is there such a thing as toxic femininity?
Have you watched Mean Girls?
I can't say I've watched it, but I know the movie and I've seen trailers and stuff.
And there's a new Tina Fey movie, I think, right?
Okay.
An update of it. But yeah, and I think this relates to the debate about social media and the way that social media is so particularly damaging to the mental health of teen girls and young women, because it's very relational. And so the relational bullying that girls and young women are more likely to engage in than men are. So men are more likely, historically, much less so today, but to have bullied physically.
Yeah.
Women are much more likely to bully relationally. So they exclude you. You're not my best friend anymore. You're not invited. You're etc. And they bully by using, how you look. But so that relational bullying gets kind of amplified by social media. And so if you were to try and define toxic femininity, I suspect that's where you would go, and it would be around ostracism and meanness. If you think the Mean Girls phenomenon is getting at something real, which is the ability of kind of women to be pretty brutal to each other, it's probably something more around that. But I just think putting the word toxic before either femininity or masculinity is just a bad move. I think it's a bad move intellectually, and I think it's a terrible move culturally.
There's so much truth to that. And I think there's so many women that are listening right now that are nodding their head and can relate in various ways because of the way that society is to some degree now. But that's not the narrative we hear, that a woman would turn to you and ask you to be more masculine in the context of sort of the typical idea of what masculinity means, or at least what it means to her.
Yeah, almost the opposite. It would be with the toxic, back to your point about it, is masculinity the problem? Which I thought it was. And it took her to point out that no, it's how it's expressed that's the question. And for me, it was like I thought that being assertive in the relationship was somehow bad because it was associated with kind of, patriarchy, masculinity, and like men dominating, and it's really interesting. Like I'll bring it down to like a more benign level. I think a lot of young women, actually, one of the things they feel about a lot of young men is that they're a bit passive. And it's almost like a lot of those men almost don't feel they have permission to be assertive. And what women, like, it's fun for you and I to talk about what women want, isn't it? But I think there's something like what a lot of the women I talk to say is like, I just want someone who's my equal. And that's so weird to say now, right? But they want someone that's a partner that's with them. And they say, well, what should we do tonight? Or, where should we go for dinner? And if he says, I don't know, you decide. I don't mind, right? It's always just like, well, no, you decide and you make a plan and you book it. You like show some agency here. And I might not always agree with you or even like it. We can get into that, right? But just going passive is not what makes you a good partner or a good feminist. And I think I'm older than you. Maybe my generation of men have really struggled more with that, just because I think there was this kind of strong sense that we needed to sort of, just in order for women to become bigger, we had to make ourselves smaller. And I think that was a profound intellectual and, for me, emotional and relational error. The point is, we all need to get bigger. We all want to rise and grow and challenge each other to grow, not silence ourselves or bench ourselves.